So, why not our voices? It is early May, and I'm sitting here in London, trying to write something clever and Keynote-like. I'm in awe of my esteemed fellow presenters. I've chosen Why Not Our Voices, a subject I have been trying to think, make work and write about in different ways over the last few years. For this presentation I've made a number of false starts. I can't find my way into my subject, which is still hazy and unformed in my mind. I know that I want to talk about margins and centres, whiteness and privilege, gender, feminism and intersectionality, but the same two thoughts keep going around my head. Whose voice am I not listening to? Does sound art matter? Whose voice am I not listening to? Does sound art matter? Whose voice am I not listening to? Does sound art matter? Whose voice am I not listening to? Does sound art matter? There is a voice I'm trying to ignore a lot of the time. It is the not terribly insistent, yet nevertheless constantly present voice of my mother. In her late 80s, alone for the first time in her life, gradually sliding into dementia, losing language, technical ability, self-confidence, moving more and more into an internal world as she is able to share with the outside. It is a voice I'm ignoring because it's difficult for me. Emotionally difficult, because I don't need all these unresolved emotions. I need to be able to think. Difficult for me time-wise, because I need time in order to be able to devote my attention to writing this talk and my complicated job that my mother has never quite understood. I need space to make my works of sound art that my mother has never heard, although she features in many of them as a reader and as a speaker. I need to be able to think. I need time. I need space. I need to be able to think. I need time. I need space. I need to be able to think. I need time. I need space. I think I should pull out so that I can spend time and effort that I'm putting into preparing and being at this event on trying to work out what the options might be for my mother and trying to make her feel safe and more supported. There are lots of keynote speakers anyway, so it won't make any difference if I'm there or not. But something, vanity, the desire to try and make sense of my conflicting thoughts, the desire to hear and meet other speakers, makes me really unwilling to do this. Anyway, I've worked hard to earn the privilege of this invitation, and I want to enjoy it. I've tried to start this talk on Why Not Our Voices in so many ways, talking about my own sound journey, talking about the emergence of sound art, and talking about how sound art needs a place where there is a pluriverse of voices to be heard, rather than the voices that are heard. I want to talk about how we need a sonic activism to make our culture pluralistic, and how we need to educate ourselves to listen better and listen anew. My mother is not an artist or an academic. She does not know that a sound arts canon exists. She does not care. She has, like so many of our mothers, and some cases our fathers, spent her life subservient to others, sacrificing her own desires, comfort, time and energy. And I, one of those who's benefited massively from this, am ambivalent about even listening to her. Or maybe I can listen to her, but it makes me uncomfortable. It demands my attention. It demands my time. And I have other things to do. I have other things to do. Am I listening to her? Am I hearing her? What does listening and hearing in this case mean? And what can it tell us about listening and hearing in sound arts
and the world. So for this presentation, I want to concentrate on listening in the voice, talking about the voice as an extended concept, who we listen to and how we listen, specifically to the voice in its partner language. I want to consider our relationship to the voices of the marginalised, the small, the peripheral, and the largely unheard, as well as those voices that are misunderstood or are heard but ignored. I want to think about the fact that in sound arts we do so much listening to the environment, to other species, to objects, to other forms of matter, but so little of that listening is to people. Actually, I spend a lot of time listening to my mother's voice, often on the phone, often more than I wish to. It is repetitive and she's less and less able to listen to me, and that upsets me, but maybe it's also a useful lesson. She would, by the way, be furious if she knew I was talking about her now. I do not always hear what she might be asking of me, and sometimes I ignore it because it's not convenient or comfortable. I do not always act on what I hear. So it is these very simple everyday forms of hearing and listening. Whose voices are we listening to? And are we able to hear what lies beneath the words? That I would like to try and reflect upon and discuss in the rest of this talk in relation to the field of sound arts practice as it's currently constituted, with particular reference to some of the problems and dichotomies as I see them today. As you will hear, this raises many questions. So the first of my reflections concerns whose voices are we listening to? Do we have choices? Are we only listening to our own voices? And the ancillary question, who are we? In the five senses, Michel Serres recalls an experience of quiet meditation in the ruins of the perfect acoustic theatre at Aarhus, Greece, where he is enjoying his own silence. He asks of the busload of tourists who noisily interrupt, quote, what did they hear that they did not know already from their language memory? Did they come to Epidaurus at all? They arrived ill, indisposed by the murmurings of their organs, surrounded by their collective noise, and they departed in that clamorous ship without ever really arriving. If they had talked, shouted, conversed with each other in Boston or Aachen, they would have made the same journey. Alone on this step, sitting in silence for the last 2 hours, little by little, the world gives me its gods. Immersed in the social ship, I would only have picked up stray bits of language from the people around me. The group carries its gods in bags and Walkmans. End quote. Serres questions whether, if you are too busy making your own noise or sounding, you are able to listen to the world around you. Thus, sounding and listening are pitted against each other. One is a way of trying to, quote, catch the harmony of the world, and the other as emptying out the universe with our thunderous techniques, so that the earth is engulfed by noise, and the whole universe resounds with our fury. In Serres' world, we humans are set apart from other species in that we are enclosed in language, which stops us from seeing that the noise that it makes veils and overwhelms the things which compose our world and causes them to vanish. Thus Serres rates listening above sounding and silence above speaking. There is no doubt that this exhortation to silence and proper listening is one of the tropes of sound art and music before it. Sound art has taken these listenings outside the concert hall, into the gallery, and into ever more exotic fields. Listening is now the subject of an ever-growing number of books, research projects, PhDs, and even artworks. Max Neuhaus's Listen series, with its exhortation to listen, is one of the cornerstones of sound art. But does the figure of the lone listener, often male, now also a trope within sound arts practice, make for a better sonic engagement with the world than a listening engagement with the noisy, disruptive mob? Could this silent, solitary listening be said to constitute a welcome escape, a disengagement from the noisy, disruptive mob? Does listening to the noisy din of nature really tell us more about the world than the noisy din of people? Or does it just tell us different things we have chosen to fetishise over other things? There are plenty of people who think so, even though they might not have said it in quite this way. If we are always at the centre of our own listening, just by the fact we wear our own ears and sound is all around us, why do so many of us love to distance ourselves from it through using the microphone and the headphones? And why is the din of nature so often our choice of listening material than the din of humanity? At this point, I must say that, of course, like all of you, I love nature. I love the world, I love the solitary, the remote, the abandoned, and I love the adventure of going to listen in a place, and it is part of a lot of my work. But here, now, I want to think through what this means for me and for the wider practices in sonic arts. When we are escaping to our solitary listening, what are we escaping from? What positions do we adopt to escape these things, with family, with work, with wider social relationships? And what privileges are we calling on in order to be able to escape them? Is this escape open to everyone? What are the challenges and demands that we are not meeting in order to make this silent, solitary listening escape? Or rather, who are we not listening to in order to be able to do this? We all need some solitary time, but do we really want to be part of a discipline that is built on such a lack of communication between people that puts the purity of the uninterrupted listening experience above all else? But I hear you think, surely listening is an act of engagement with the world. But the listening we're discussing here, the listening of the solitary listener in the wild, that listening is outrage. The listening to outrage at being interrupted is, I would postulate, a disengagement, a silent withdrawal, a temporary retreat. Could this be even seen as an attempt to take over an acoustic space that defies anyone else to join, that holds its ground against uninvited noise, whether vocal or not, a territorialisation of the acoustic? While this on the one hand could be considered a marvellously egalitarian view, one in which we give space to other species and the matter that we share the world with, so that they are not overwhelmed by our emptying out the universe with our thunderous techniques, could it not also be seen as a position of privilege, open to only to some, and safeguarded through moral high ground and legislation? One of the ways that we do this is through demonising some noise or even some voices. That was an excerpt from a song called Social Problem from Tony Schwartz's 1955 album, Nueva York, a taped documentary of Puerto New Yorkers. In her study of this album, Jennifer Stover Ackerman investigates listening, quote, as an interpretive site where racial difference is coded, produced and policed, excavating invocations of peace and quiet and descriptions of noise to reveal the racialised edges of both terms. Stover goes on to develop her notion of the sonic colour line as, quote, a dominant sonic protocol that attempts to contain the sound of others and silence alternative listening practices as aberrant and dangerous, even inhuman. This is borne out by my later examples regarding the comparison of women's voices to animals. Stover reminds us that we have, quote, raced, gendered and historicised listening ears, an expression I use as a theoretical construct to describe how listening functions as an embodied cultural process that echoes and shapes one's orientation to power and one's posture towards the world. And as the dominant listening ear is disciplined to process white male ways of sounding as default, natural, normal and desirable, alternative ways of listening and sounding are deemed aberrant and, depending on the historical context, as excessively sensitive, strikingly deficient, or impossibly both. This can apply to speech as much as other sounds such as music and the ambient sounds of everyday living, which are frequently dismissed as noise or being too loud. Stover's paper is very much concerned with how loudness in particular seems to be a quality of noise frequently linked to ethnic communities.
With all that is animal. In terms of gender, at various times and in many cultures, women's voices have been compared with all that is animal, lowly and venial. Journalist Sally Feldman tells us how they screech like fishwives, laugh like drones, shriek like hyenas, nag like sirens, cackle like hens. The other side to the base animalistic qualities of women's voices relates to sexual temptation and seduction. Sirens are here said to nag, but they are more commonly thought of as femme fatale, who lead men astray, a byword for the seductive female voice that leads to death and corruption. The Judeo-Christian world has long considered the voices of women to be indecent and a temptation to lust. They were forbidden for speaking in church. Quote, not only were women disqualified from liturgical singing, they were also banned from sermonising. When they did begin to take on a more public role, they were often ridiculed as freaks. A woman's preaching, remarked Dr. Johnson, is like a dog's walking on its hind legs. It is not done well, but you are surprised to find it done at all. Similar criticism, or worse, has routinely been hurled at the suffragettes, at women activists, trade unionists and campaigners. In media, and specifically on British radio, women's voices were thought to be monotonous, sharp, unpleasing and unsuitable for the microphone. In the early days of the BBC, there were no women broadcasters at all, and although this gradually changed, there was a very long established prejudice against female voices in certain areas of radio, sport, news, and most particularly music.
German-Canadian composer Hildegard Westerkamp, iconic 1989 work, Kids Beach Soundwalk, tells us a little bit about the sounds of the voices we can and can't hear. The piece still opens up new layers of meaning to me on every listening. For now, I just want to concentrate on what she has to tell us about the nature of listening, solitariness and escape. Let's listen to some of the work together.
It's a calm morning. I'm on Kids Beach in Vancouver. It's slightly overcast and very mild for January. It's absolutely wind still. The ocean is flat, just a bit rippled in places. Ducks are quietly floating on the water. I'm standing among some large rocks full of barnacles and seaweed. The water moves calmly through crevices. The barnacles put out their fingers to feed on the water. The tiny clicking sounds that you hear are the meeting of the water and the barnacles. It trickles and clicks and sucks and... The city is roaring around these tiny sounds, but it's not masking them. I could shock you or fool you by saying that the soundscape is this loud. But it is more like this. The view is beautiful. In fact, it is spectacular. So the sound level seems more like this. It doesn't seem that loud. But I'm trying to listen to those tiny sounds in more detail now. Suddenly, the background sound of the city seems louder again. It interferes with my listening. It occupies all acoustic space, and I can't hear the barnacles in all their tininess.
So, as I'm sure you know, the work starts with an environmental recording of the gentle lapping of water at Kids Beach, Vancouver. Hildegard starts by trying to mediate the experience of her listeners and moves towards recounting her own experience within that listening environment. For Hildegard, it is not Sarah's noisy group of individuals that interrupt his silence, but the monstrous city. Like Sarah's in Epidaurus, Hildegard also wants to withdraw, but her place of withdrawal is not away from the social, but to an alternative social space.
In one dream, women living in an ancient mountain village were weaving the most beautiful silken fabric. It sounded like 1,000,000 tiny voices, whispering, swishing, clicking, sizzling. In another dream, when I entered a stone cottage, I entered a soundscape made by 4 generations of a peasant family sitting around a large wooden table eating and talking, smacking and clicking and sucking and spitting and telling and biting and singing and laughing and weeping and kissing and gurgling and whispering. tiny marbles. A man was pursuing me with a gun. I was frightened, but the bullets tinkled. Metallic, tiny, seductive semen tinkling all around me. Like in Emöke's concert PH2, made from the sounds of the discharge of smouldering charcoal, tinkling all over the Brussels pavilion, like needles darting from everywhere, as Emöke says. You can hear excellent.
Once we've got over the kind of overt sort of hippie romanticism of Hildegard's visions, we can see that for Hildegard, the monster is more than the noise of the city or Sarah's thunderous techniques. She doesn't, like Sarah, seek to capture the harmony of the world, but posits imaginary sound worlds or utopian dream spaces. So even when the monstrous city is removed, the small sounds still cannot be heard because they've not yet earned a place in the soundscape. Hildegard is not using her listening to know the world. She's refusing to listen to the world as it is and finding solace in a new, different, as yet unheard soundscape. Westerkamp's commentary suggests an unbalanced world where individual voices are silenced by an imposed authoritarianism manifested through sound. The work allows her to rebalance this by promoting a change of listening habits and the regaining of an individual's inner voice.
In another dream, sitting in the car with a woman friend, I heard sounds of glass blinking and tinkling, sparkling. On the car radio they announced that it was Mozart, the way Tomatis wants us to hear Mozart, tinkling and sparkling.
Westerkamp's description of a man pursuing her with a gun directly linked to Xenakis' Concrete PH, the work made in 1958 from the sounds of charcoal for playback over 425 loudspeakers in the Philips Brazilian Brussels, surely makes a direct connection between male aggression and Xenakis' music, or maybe the monstrous city and the vast amount of speakers used for playback of Concrete PH. In Kids Beach Soundwalk, Hildegard does not simply reject noise and embrace silence, as Brandon Labella suggested, or as Joanna Demis has suggested, idealised, quote, a few different underdogs, women at the mercy of violent men toting guns, nature at the mercy of industrialisation, and quietness at the mercy of loudness. Westerkamp clearly intends with these choices to liberate and empower voices that normally go mute, end quote. But she has reclaimed her voice and used technology to suggest how she can reject the monstrous city and possibly its correlation with the monstrous ego of the male composer to make space for the unheard and unrecognised small sounds of domestic activity and bring a wider range of being and belonging into our sonic world. What Hildegard has suggested is not listening to the sound world that is masked out by the noise of humanity, of the capitalist industrial present, and not even to Sarah's harmony of the world, but to a world that does not yet exist, that has never existed for her, a utopian world of different social relations made possible by technology. There can be few people in this audience who are not familiar with the criticisms of gender and race, and what at this moment in time are still, with regard to what at this moment in time are largely regarded as the canonical foundations of sound art. Academic books, concert programmes, university departments, exhibitions, all attest to the white male canon of sound art. But we who profess to love sound and who wish to listen to sound in all its manifestations are contributing to building and maintaining this canon. How is this largely male and largely white territory policed? What are the agents through which some voices are kept out? Let's return to Sarah's. Quote, the group devotes itself to its own din, revels in its own roar, notices little outside himself. I think in this case we can take sound art as the noisy din, hidden in our own language. As Sarah says, groups imprison themselves behind their language of wood, wind and ivory. Language is an addiction, a prison that traps us in the known and keeps us hearing the world that exists independent of men. So in the second of these reflections, I want to ask, are we able to hear what lies beyond the words? How are we as a group imprisoning ourselves behind our language? And how can we hear beneath the surfaces of the visible, where visible in this case might also be read as the obvious and the easy? What language have we adopted for the discourses of sound art? Is that language, as Sayers and many others before him suggested, a prison that traps us in the known? British artist Mark Peter Wright's 2013 work, A Proposed Vocabulary Exchange, concerns itself primarily with the language of field recording. This playful video points out that much of the vocabulary used in field recording is borrowed from the military. Words such as capture, aim and shoot. What can this tell us about sound arts practice? Does the colonial mindset that this work gently exposes really underlie it? Other theorists and works expose how our listening and talking about our relationship to sound might be colonised, emanating as it does for our own subjectivities. In a post on whiteness and sound studies in the online platform Sounding Out, American academic Gus Stedler reveals the link between racism, listening and early recordings with reference to, quote, descriptive speciality, a period name for spoken word recordings about news events and slices of life that reenacted the lynchings of black men. These lynching recordings appear to be part of the same overall entertainment market as the ones lampooning foreign accents and Negro dialect. That is, they were all meant to exhibit the wonders of the new sound reproduction to Americans on street corners, at country fairs and in other public venues. Stadler also claims that, quote, the overarching context colouring these early encounters with the mechanical reproduction of sound was that of a deeply entrenched, aggressive, white supremacist racism. Today we would hope that our white supremacist racism is less deeply entrenched and less aggressive, but we would find it difficult to deny its existence, and aspects of our listening are imbued with it. Our understanding and interpretation of what we hear is totally predicated on who we are. As Stadler says, what does an ever nearer, ever louder police siren sound like in an urban neighbourhood, depending on the listener's racial identity? Artists such as Lawrence Abu Hamdan, Laura Malacart and Imogen Stidworthy, indeed many artists working with sound, particularly those who concern themselves with voice and language, have interrogated and revealed the institutional and personal racism predicated on the speaking voice. In another moment of trying to express my undeveloped thoughts into words, trying to write about one of my most recent experiences in my long-term engagement working in the Outer Hebrides, Scottish Gaelic is still spoken in these remote islands off the west coast of Scotland, and the islands have a rich and distinctive cultural identity, as well as a complex history of foreign invasion by both the Norwegians and the English, settlement, forced migration, and cultural and linguistic repression. Almost every geographical feature on the islands has a name, which reflects this history and culture. In a recent residency, I worked with some of the island's inhabitants, young and old, to investigate the resonances of place names and how they transcribe or fix memories and historical events onto the landscape. In my listening to oral history archive material, interviews and conversations with people of all ages, I was struck with how, for the Hebridean Gael, time periods often seem to collapse, and people, places and events which
I don't think there's anywhere that I don't like to go.
in the last 300 years or so
You like everywhere? Yeah.
would be spoken about in the same sentence as today's events, and furthermore be totally understood in conversation between two people. Place names, when spoken between Hebrideans, seem to be so much more than a place name. I speculated that the various soundings of the place names of the Outer Hebrides gave access to unique deep maps. By that I mean what Deborah Hedden, talking about autobiographical performance, has called the accumulation of narratives that adhere to sites.
I really like going.
I like to go back.
Yeah, I like going.
Studying with Michael Aarhus, share idea, and I just.
Speaking these names aloud renders them as a spell or incantation, full of people, individual lives, communal history, story, song, place, identity and home, so that the people of the Hebrides constantly reimagine the map, fluid, fractured, contested, layered and mixed up, a space of social practice that is performed and re-performed with every story, with every local history project and with every visit to a grandparent. But somehow I knew that my writing had not done justice to what I had ear-witnessed in people's conversations. Weeks after I had sent the paper for peer review, I realised what I'd been trying to say. In her paper, Black American feminist Bell Hooks talks of marginality. In this case, the marginality of Black Americans, quote, as much more than a site of deprivation, also as a site of radical possibility, a space of resistance. It was this marginality that I was naming as a central occasion for the production of a counter-hegemonic discourse that is not just found in words, but in habits of being and the way one lives. As such, I was not speaking of a marginality one wishes to lose, to give up, or surrender as part of moving into the centre, but rather as a site one stays in, clings to even, because it nourishes one's capacity to resist. It offers the possibility of radical perspectives from which to see and create, to imagine alternative new worlds. This is not a mythic notion of marginality. It comes from lived experience. When Bob Marley sings, "We refuse to be what you want us to be, we are what we are, and that's the way it's going to be," that space of refusal, where one can say no to the coloniser, no to the downpresser, is located in the margins. End quote. What I heard between people in the Outer Hebrides was the articulation of that resistance, something I was unable to find the language for without Hooke's eloquent explanation. Words and language here are so much more than their mere surface meaning. They are so powerful, We have to listen so carefully to the language we partake in and try and hear what listens beyond the words, to escape the prison of our own language and to hear what lies beneath the surfaces of the visible. For a long time, sound art is said to be emergent. I think it has now emerged with its canonical foundations laid and understood. The message is clear. Although this is an emergent, relatively recent discipline, our formation and thus our perspectives are based on the ideas and foundational work of white people, mainly men. As Stadler says, whiteness, masquerading as lack of bias, can operate to guarantee the coherence and legibility of a field in formation. My colleague Holly Ingleton recently suggested to me that sound art had entered a post-sound art era. By this she meant that the canonical foundations are laid and understood enough to be challenged on any of the grounds that other disciplines have been redefined by. This is being done in all sorts of places in all sorts of ways. Conferences, exhibitions, concerts and soon publications are discovering and revealing the lost and unheard voices of women composers and sound artists, and histories and analyses of sound arts practice from post-colonial, queer and feminist perspectives, among others. Just as the formations of sound arts are solidifying, they are being challenged and extended through work. We have moved into a post-sound art era. Let us all embrace that position before sound arts becomes atrophied. Let us embrace Hook's, quote, radical perspectives from which to see and create, to imagine alternate new worlds, that enables the expression of a different position, a position that is both marginal and central. Let us question our listening. There's no room here for unquestioning obedience. Just as not all soundings are the same, not all listenings are the same. We need to educate ourselves. We need to listen to a wide range of voices, not just those that are familiar to us, or those that we can isolate ourselves to listen to without interruption and without challenge, maybe by withdrawing. Why does sound art theory concern itself so little with listening to people, leaving that instead to the realms of oral history, psychoanalysis and self-help? We need to interrogate which voices have been invited into the sound arts canon and what language they have had to speak in order to receive this invitation. We need to understand how this invitation has worked for some and against others, and we need ultimately not to change the terms of the invitation and make it different, but to rip the invitation up. Let us develop a new critical listening, one that considers how our different subjectivities, our race, class, gender, nationhood, might affect our listening. We need, as Stadler believes, scholarship that explicitly confronts and broadcasts the underlying whiteness of the field, and I would like to include other non-normative subjectivities in that, and of the generic terms that provide so much currency in it, terms like listener, the body, the ear, and so on. Let us try and hear beneath the surface and question what lies beneath the voices and language that sound arts has included and integrated into its core. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cathy. I'm opening the floor for reactions and questions and comments. Yeah. While you think, I might start with one of my observations and thoughts after this inspiring and very performatively complex and engaging talk. I think I engaged in your talk on different levels because you presented some ideas and you also performed a situation where I had to engage in your ideas while engaging in a performance of this, and that's my question. Would be something in relation between representation and performance, you can say, or maybe technology and the representation of difference, because you started out by talking about a listening situation where people are using technologies in creating a sort of an individual spectacle of listening practices. And much sound art does that as well, creating a situation where you're immersed in a space of spectacular sound. And on the other hand, there is this need to listen beyond this spectacle, to listen for representations of difference and identity, and so on. So my question would be how is that a problem? The techno spectacular part of much sound art, is that sort of in conflict with the question of representation? And how do you think of our possibility of engaging in this difference?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily a conflict, but I think that the way that it's manifested within sound arts practice and the way that it's kind of the sort of trope that's been kind of established is potentially a problem. I mean, I suppose I wanted to think about trying to do something that was sort of quite speculative. I don't feel I have answers. I feel I've got an awful lot of questions. But I wanted to just try and open up to sort of question some of those things about listening, and in a way, as a sort of sideline technology, to sort of, yes, just try and kind of shed a slightly different light on it. And I think it was British philosopher Nina Power suggested that for women specifically, technology had a utopian potential. And I think that might be true, but I don't know whether technology has sort of reached its utopian potential in any way, and that maybe the way that it's used within sound arts practice as it stands at the moment, particularly that kind of the sort of extra technologized listening, you know, extensions, has become a kind of trope that we maybe don't question enough.
Thank you.
I have a question, but I actually have two questions. The one question is, who you say we have to listen, and I was thinking who. First of all, I want to say that I really loved your presentation. I thought it was really thought-provoking. But when you say that we have to listen, so now we're a bunch of researchers, and so do you mean that as a metaphor that I have to broaden my scope when I write about sound art and think of including not only the white male canon that we're reproducing, or do you mean it actually that I should listen? And the second question is regarding sound art. I mean, is it just enough to hear these voices, or is it a specific way of representing these voices? I mean, is it something about the artistic form? Because we hear a lot of female voices all the time in pop music, but it's like there's a specific form that somehow will allow these voices to be something else than just this other. I mean, to escape this otherness that they can be captured in. So I have these two questions regarding us as researchers, and then
Yeah.
capacity of sound art to somehow allow us to listen really actually to other voices.
Yeah. I mean, it's difficult. I suppose what I'm trying to question really is how, well, yesterday there was a lot of talk about listening. And lots of really, really interesting things were said about listening. Listening has got a kind, and I feel that, you know, that sound arts is kind of based on this whole kind of, you must listen, you must have a better listening. But I feel that what the better listening that we've been asked to have is not necessarily, it's not better in every way. It's maybe better in some ways in that it's intense or it's attentive. But listening has the same root, I believe, as obedience, you know, in its sort of Latin root. It comes from the same verb, to be obedient and to listen. And I suppose what I'm saying is, do we want to be that obedient? You know, do we want to obediently listen in a kind of very intense way without questioning what we're listening to, how it's formulated, and, you know, how it's kind of developed from, if you like, the sort of foundational starting points of sound art. So I suppose what I'm suggesting, yes, is that as individuals and as a kind of body of people, if that's what we are, that we could actually interrogate listening in different ways. That, you know, that it's time to open it up. It keeps on being opened up, and it's time to open it up a little bit more, and to just think about, what we're listening to, why we're listening to some things more than others, and how we interpret what we take from that listening. So, you know, there's been a lot of, in the visual arts, for example, there's been a lot of deconstruction of the image, and, you know, from things like Berger's ways of seeing, and Stuart Hall's work. I don't know how well this translates to this audience, but, you know, there's been a lot of questioning of how we see what we see, how we read the image. And I guess maybe what I'm sort of suggesting is that we need to apply some of that to our hearing as well. That hearing has been seen to some extent as a kind of something that isn't subjectively or kind of socially constituted, and that maybe we need to re-examine that. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question I can't remember.
I don't know if I can ask, if there's a long row of speakers, I could also pass on the microphone.
Okay.
But the second question was if sound art has then any, I mean, is it what specific quality is it that sound has, or that sound art has? Because I said, you know, there are many pop songs where we hear, I mean, there are a lot of female voices actually that are heard, a specific kind of, and a specific kind of voices out there that we're listening to. So what is it about sound art that, and is it even possible, or how is it possible that to bring an awareness about these questions?
I mean, this is a long, very big subject, I think, and it sort of takes me a little bit to, you know, some of my starting points in this work were as somebody that worked in a sort of nascent sound arts department, looking at who our students were, who applied, what sort of proportion, you know, what gender balance there was, etc., etc. I mean, this is something that's happened a lot. And recently, many of you might know that musician and anthropologist Georgina Bourne has done amazing work on this as part of a large kind of international project. So it was sort of started off looking at that, and then it kind of developed into this sort of archival project of which I think there's a lot of them around at the moment, which was sort of much more about finding out the kind of forgotten women composers, the forgotten women sound artists, wondering why, although she's very well known at the moment, Pauline Oliveros, you know, 5 years ago, she hadn't performed in London for, well, I don't think she'd ever performed in London. You know, she wasn't getting the sort of same exposure as sort of male composers of a generation. But and so that's one aspect of it. That's a kind of very much a kind of practical, here are the voices, the extended voices, we are gathering them together, we're putting them back in the mainstream. But I suppose what I'm trying to go is a step further than that, and to just say that, you know, actually it's more than that. It's more than that. It's that it's deeper than, I find it very difficult to express it. It's deeper than that, that the subjectivities that we are considering and incorporating into our thinking and that we are allowing to dominate are not wide. They're still narrow. It's not just a question of saying, here are these women composers, here's this sort of history of kind of experimental music in, you know, I don't know, Africa, or, you know, it's these sort of small histories are not really enough. There needs to be more of a sort of basic cultural questioning and cultural shift, potentially.
Can you pass that?
Thank you for your presentation. It was really good. But I was just, one thought occurred to me, which is there's also an aspect that in sound art we don't consider very often, which is something I was thinking about, which is when not to listen.
Yeah.
And I think actually not listening is a undervalued activity, because the male ego is just going to keep blabbing and blabbing, the white male ego, and so you have to actually teach people not to listen. And I think that's really, just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I'm a great proponent of not listening. And I sort of, that's, in a way, that was kind of my starting point, was how to try and think about not listening when everything around me was about listening.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah.
Can you, no, that's fine.
So glad I didn't do that.
So Cathy, just in relation to in relation to issues about teaching, it's
yes.
I feel very incumbent to engage with a truly diverse range of source material. It's very difficult to find that. I wondered how you felt about some recent precedents, Stephen O'Malley citing his interest in Alice Coltrane, for example, or it's not so recent Jacques Attali's references to free jazz and Archie Shepp, or Koji Ishin's interest in Afrofuturism, and whether there was all of that material is from quite a long time ago, even if it is, even if it concerns African musicians. Can you offer any other models that we might look at?
I think there's going to be a lot of stuff coming out and being published on this quite soon, actually. That's my feeling, is that over the next few years there will be new material. I can't find that much material. I mean, I find the Sounding Out blog has been a really, really rich source of material. I don't know whether everybody knows that. And again, I think some of the work that Georgina Bourne and some of the people that she's associated with has been really useful. But I can't, and I don't really know, I don't know enough about the jazz, the jazz side of things at all, and the writings there. I feel there's a lot of artwork, however, that I would draw upon, and it's quite interesting that Kojo Eshwan is now part of the Otolith group, and the Otolith group have been making a lot of audio-visual work that kind of questions post-colonial history, colonial histories, and in common with a lot of other people actually working in the visual arts world, which has been quite very sort of much more kind of a rich area for me.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was really, really good. I was wondering about, you brought Mark Peter Wright up, and I think that was, I really like his work too, and he speaks a lot about microphones as these like spies and violators, kind of recently, and the microphone is this bug that poses our voice against us sometimes, or a voice that sort of betrays us. And Lawrence Abu Hamdan that you mentioned also does this with how our voices in forensic analysis and these analyses of border controls that can be used as evidence against us before that we even know that we're giving evidence. So I'm just thinking of the voice as not free of this hegemony of the white male, as you say, and it inserts itself through these technologies, and I was wondering if you could speak to that a bit more, if the idea is that we put more diverse voices out there, do you have maybe some considerations about how these voices are being modulated, both through technologies, but just in the way that, the putting voices out there is also is maybe not enough, or maybe there's more than voices that we can put out there in order to diversify the...
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, I'm really interested in those sort of systems of control and systems of sort of othering. And the way that, I mean, I think, you know, for me, bell hooks in this particular way has been really, really interesting, because one of the things she says in that same paper that I quoted from is that is basically we want to be heard ourselves. We don't want you to invite us and then reinterpret us and tell us what we're saying. We want to say it. And I think that, you know, I suppose I haven't got a concept here. You know, I've just got a lot of things that don't quite add up. But I think on the one hand, the way that different voices are demonised, sometimes through technology, sometimes through the media, you know, sometimes just through groups of friends, sometimes just through, you know, you want to get to sleep and there's a load of really noisy people outside, you know, all those kind of things. Those things, those social things, are important because our sound experiences from outside are important to our sound experiences as sort of artists and as sound art theorists. And so I feel we need to kind of make some connection between these things in order to be able to have that kind of wider appreciation of how these systems of control and how these mechanisms work, basically.
I just wanted to go back to, you were talking about the relationship between listening and obeying, and the Latin root of, I think it's audition, and there's a distinction there between hearing and listening. So I think it's hear is to obey, whereas listening has a different sort of inflection to it, and many writers make that distinction between hearing, which is a kind of automatic response, and listening, which is a different kind of mode of understanding. So, so I wanted to put that second idea of listening, which is perhaps not obeying, you know, not this sort of automatic reaction, in the light of listening to everything, listening to the world without any kind of barriers or filters. Because the minute that you put a microphone in front of your mouth, or the minute you put something on tape, you've already made a delimitation. So if you're wanting to expand the realm of listening to, you know, include everything, then you really can't have a microphone, and you can't have a tape recorder, and you can't have transmission, and basically you can't really have art in that sense of a frame. You just have to have everything. you know, and for one of the things that Sarah writes about, which I think is sort of interesting, is that you actually do need some filters. Art needs filters,
Yeah.
right? It can't be art. And we need filters or we'd go deaf. You know, there are noises that will, you know, disable us. So could you reframe what you're saying perhaps in relation to those distinctions, those limitations that are absolutely necessary for our own health, and if there is to be art, then
Okay, so essentially I'm not sure whether I kind of totally agree with the hearing listening distinction. I mean, obviously loads of people have made that distinction, although sometimes I get quite confused because different people seem to have made it in different ways. But I feel that hearing, even if it isn't an active act, has some sort of, you know, it's subliminal. It's going to be filtered through our kind of subjectivity in different ways. And it isn't an there's nothing sort of innocent about hearing, any more than there's anything innocent about listening. You know, in a way, hearing is almost more frightening because you haven't got any kind of filter on it necessarily. You know, because potentially it's just all sort of coming in, and somehow unconsciously, maybe, you're processing it all in various ways that you're not conscious of. In terms of the filters, I guess what I'm saying is really, really simple, which is what are the filters we're using? How are they manifested? How are they created? And are they the filters we want to be using? You know, it's essentially.
Fantastic presentation, Cathy, and I think my voice is going but this gets me thinking about this fantastic chapter written by Kirkpatrick called Crypt Voices on the Radio. And I kind of realised myself that I've been a kind of radio fascist in terms of choosing voices that, you know, are radiophonic and not wanting people who stutter or have high voices or the voice doesn't fit for radio. So I have found that a really useful way of thinking about this thing, and I think it totally ties in with everything that you've been saying today, this idea that we unconsciously want to get the best recording sometimes and will not choose certain people because their voice doesn't fit. So that's just a kind of comment rather than a question. But you might have more to say on this if you...
I mean, I think that's absolutely, and I think that Anne Karpf is really interesting on that in her book on the human voice, and she's got a kind of radio, a kind of BBC background, and I mean, it extends into all sorts of areas, sort of every area of kind of sound, every characteristic of sound, you know, frequency, pitch, timbre, but then also other things like accent and language, usage, those kind of things.
Do we have time for one or two short questions?
Hi, thank you once. Thank you again. Speaking from the artist's perspective, understanding the need and the continued efforts to challenge privilege and the ways in which the art that is created is problematic. What advice would you give, based on the challenges you've kind of laid down for the researchers, what challenges would you provide for the artists in terms of trying to continue the progressive work towards inclusivity?
I'm not sure I can give advice. I really, really, really don't feel qualified to advise. I feel that the work needs to be on ourselves, you know, in discussion, and that's a kind of it's a kind of life work as well as an artwork, really. Sorry, that's a terrible answer, but that's the best I can do, I'm afraid. Do you have any advice?
I mean, I certainly think as an artist, it's incumbent upon you to be as aware of what's happening in the academic community in terms of discussions and debates about what's going on and where your work might be situated. So I think it's always important to be aware of what's being said. I think it's often from the artistic perspective you get kind of lost and very stubborn about wanting to do things the way you want to do it and having something be pure in some kind of artificial way in terms of what your particular vision is. But as you've stated, there is an ongoing relationship between the art that you create and the audience that is kind of taking it in, and the world in which the art you've made is being fashioned in. And if you are obviously susceptible to negative influences in terms of privilege from the society around you, and I think it's just incumbent upon you to just be aware of how your work might play into that and how you might seek to address it as an artist. So that's probably the best advice I can give from my end.
I mean, I'm sorry, my answer was flippant, and I didn't mean it to be flippant, actually, because I think that as an artist, I feel it's much more difficult. I mean, it is very much personal. It's very much a case of your own awareness and trying to be aware about how things might be understood. But as so many people said very eloquently yesterday, once it sort of leaves you, you have no control, really, over how things are understood by other people. But as an academic, I feel actually that that I can have much more. I can be much more active. Actually, I feel in some ways I can be more academic, more active as an academic than as an artist with a capital A, maybe, because I can actually engage people in all sorts of ideas that maybe are much more difficult, or maybe I need to be a much better artist to actually be able to do through my art. Maybe one day that will happen, but yeah.
Okay, that will be the last concluding words after this brilliant talk. Thank you, Cathy.
Thank you.